Okay, the mic's on. We're good? Okay, good. So, hi, everyone. This is a big honor. I didn't know about this series until just now, and thank you, Josh, for doing this. I wanted to start off by asking you to take us through a little bit of your journey with the book, why you decided to write this, and you know, as people have said to me, I'm sure they've also been saying to you, like, this is so timely. It's so timely, as though you wrote it, you know, you had the idea yesterday because you knew that there was a huge crisis coming in reproductive rights. Obviously, that's not true. So I wonder what the context really was for you to take on this project. And particularly, there's something I've been thinking a lot about, like, there aren't a lot of mainstream books about reproductive rights for regular audiences and regular readers. And I wonder why in particular you decided that you wanted to write that kind of a book that would speak to regular readers about something that obviously we're all curious about right now, but I think when you started the project, that just wasn't the case.
Yeah, so first of all, a special thank you to you for coming really at the very last moment. I was like, I know who to reach out to. We had just been connected, and I really respect your work, and I'm so thankful to you for coming. Sure. See, even when I'm on stage, I have to introduce someone. It's pathetic. I had the idea way back in 2010. I was in France for a year, and I was reading an article in the New Yorker written by Margaret Talbot about gay marriage and sort of what would be the best approach to go about sort of legalizing gay marriage. And my ears pricked up when Norma McCorvey, who was Jane Roe, was mentioned in passing as an example of a plaintiff who was not good for her cause, the movement she represented, because she'd sort of famously switched sides. She'd gone from the pro-choice side to the pro-life side. And then it mentioned parenthetically, I think literally parenthetically, that she had not been able to have an abortion because the case sort of took too long for her to avail herself of the right that she enabled everyone to sort of enjoy. Mm-hmm. And I said to myself, of course, like the gestation of a lawsuit is longer than the gestation of a baby. And that moment sort of changed the next 12 years of my life, because I said to myself, I bet that he or she who was born, and whose conception occasioned Roe v. Wade, I just have a feeling, even though I read that Norma Jane Roe had relinquished that child to adoption, I just bet that they know who they've been born to. And that would be a very difficult thing to carry, to know that your conception led to Roe. And so that realization led me off on this crazy journey to sort of tell it very quickly. I wanted to see if I could find that person. I found out online that the pro-life, and just to tell you, I use the terms pro-life and pro-choice in my book. I feel like we should allow people to sort of call themselves what they wish to be called. So I found that the pro-life felt very strongly about this person, that he or she, whoever they were, or the sort of living incarnation of their argument against abortion. Mm-hmm. And they would say, aha, like, but for Roe, had Roe already been decided when this human being was conceived, you would have murdered her. Nothing was abstract. And I wanted to find her. I ended up finding my way to Norma. It turned out that Norma didn't wish to talk about it, and I respected that. I then reached out to Norma's partner. Norma was gay. She had to renounce her homosexuality. That was part of her, sort of the precondition of her becoming a born-again Christian and a pro-life advocate, which is really horrible and took an enormous toll on her. But the woman she had lived with for many years, a woman named Connie Gonzalez, who was really the only person in the world, and certainly among the leaders on either side of the issue, the only one who cared more about Norma than Jane Roe. She was a wonderful woman, Connie. And when I went to visit Connie, and I found her in a very sort of down-and-out home in Texas, she told me that her home was about to be foreclosed on, and everything in the garage was about to be thrown out. And oh, by the way, Norma's private papers were in the garage. And I said, don't throw those out. Those are very important papers. Those papers, by the way, are now at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, available to researchers. I got the papers, I put them in garbage bags and put them in the trunk of my rental car and went home, and at 3 in the morning I found what I was looking for, the date of birth of the youngest child. It was on one piece of paper. Norma had mentioned it in passing to a Catholic newsletter. I then found that person. She didn't wish to talk about it. And I said, you have my word that I will never write about you against your wishes. And by the way, I didn't first reach out to her. I reached out to her mother in case she hadn't known who she was born to. I wouldn't obviously upend her life. The mother said, yes, we know about Norma, but she doesn't wish to talk about it. I said, fine. But then I looked for the other 2 children Norma had given birth to and also placed for adoption. And I found them, and they did wish to participate. It took me about a year to find them. And I then got back in touch with Shelley, the quote-unquote Roe baby. And she said, now that you've found my siblings, who I've always looked for, I do want to participate. And over the next 10 years, my interest grew from the 3 children to Norma, to Roe v. Wade, to the whole of abortion in America. And the book just kept getting bigger and bigger. And in answer to your sort of second question, how was it sort of this approach? You're right. It actually, I don't think there are many books about Roe and abortion that sort of really humanize the issue the way I sort of set out to do. And I said to myself, this is such a polarizing subject. I want to talk about Roe and abortion, not through politics at all, but through human beings, and just sort of see where that takes me. And it's been very gratifying because everyone wants to sort of read a story. And when you read my book, it's an interesting thing. You end up kind of pulling for people, even if they're not on the side that you're on this issue. And sort of, we could talk a lot about how it's become politicized and polarized in this country, but my approach was really, Lawrence Tribe, the last thing to say about it, Lawrence Tribe, the famous congressional, the scholar, the constitutional scholar, he wrote that the only chance he wrote this in 1992 in his book, Clash of Absolutes. He said the only chance that America has of ever sort of getting past that clash of absolutes is if we humanize what he said, give voice to both sides of the versus, meaning the Roe versus Wade, and that's really what I tried to do.
Yeah, and a quick advertisement. I think you've done this very successfully, and the book is for sale out there. There are a few copies. And along with that, one of the astounding things about the book is, since you take this kind of narrative nonfiction and really compassionate approach, there is all kinds of nuance, and I couldn't help thinking about it when I was listening to the argument in the big Supreme Court case that's about to be decided, sometime this month or, at the latest in early July, right? And one of the Dobbs case, one of the big things that came up in the oral argument was the question of adoption, right? And several of the justices, especially Justice Amy Coney Barrett, seemed to suggest that adoption was no big deal and that, therefore abortion was not a constitutional necessity, right? That, people could just carry children to term and then under safe haven laws, drop them off at the firehouse and so on. And that would be a perfectly good alternative, right, to having legal, accessible abortion. So I wonder. Thank you. I wonder what light your story shines on that dimension of, and I think it's really complex, right? The way that the issue of adoption ramified in so many different ways for the people who are, really three-dimensional people whose stories are told in your book.
One of the really exciting things for me about
put this outside, right?
okay. One of the really exciting things for me about writing about Norma was that her life was, she sort of lived, if she was an imperfect plaintiff, she was sort of the perfect protagonist for my book, the perfect way to talk about abortion in America as a whole. Mm-hmm. Her life wended through both sides of the issue. Her life intersected with leaders on both sides of the issue. And she came to a remarkable degree to sort of embody all of the kind of complications and ambivalences and nuances that define abortion in America. So one of the things that was so gripping for me, and I hope for the reader, is, you're right. The pro-life like to say, like Justice Barrett did in this unbelievably flip way, hey, no problem, just sort of, relinquish your child to adoption, everything will be fine. Conversely, what they say is that if a woman has an abortion, she is going to suffer sort of emotionally for that. Well, the overwhelming sort of data show, and there are great studies on this, that the exact opposite is true.
Right.
That the great majority, now it is 100% true that there will be some women who have an abortion who are scarred emotionally by that. But the overwhelming majority of them express relief, not regret. And on the other side, even if a woman feels, feels devout about her decision to sort of give up a child for adoption, this is something she wishes to do, even she will often be sort of haunted by that decision for the rest of her life. Somewhere there's a child out there. This is often a very difficult thing for women. And so one of the things, and Jane Roe, she never had an abortion, as I mentioned, and she relinquished 3 children to adoption, which was very hard for her. So you just sort of follow her life, and my God, you see how she was scalded by this experience. And it was, something on both sides. I kind of call out the bullshit on both sides. And there, unfortunately, as a person who is very much pro-choice, there are things that, in my opinion, that haven't really, the pro-choice movement also sort of hasn't been totally sort of candid about. And it was nice for me, like obviously the reader of my book knows where I stand, and I even mentioned it in an author's note, but I really did try to be fair to both sides. But the adoption issue was an issue where I went right to sort of the heart through Norma's life of one of the sort of staples of the pro-life argument and said, you know what, this simply is not true.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about that issue of being tough on both sides, because I also found that, and being engaged, with both sides. I had this, in my book that's coming out, I talk a lot about racism and in the pro-choice movement, and the things that are very uncomfortable to talk about, like some of the ways in which some, not all, pro-choice advocates used so-called population control language, right? And sort of believed that there was a hierarchy of better and worse, people to be born, and that one of the reasons for abortion had to do with that. So, but I suffered a lot about feeling like, am I being unfair? Am I kicking the pro-choice movement when it's down? That was really, really the way it struck me. And I wonder if you felt that way at all too, especially as we've seen over the last year and even before that. This movement is really on the ropes. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, it was, the big journalism cliche, follow the story. And I really did. I was so uneducated about these issues when I started, so it's different than, a professor who knows exactly what she's doing and talking about, sort of diving into something like this. And in a way, my ignorance was a benefit to me because I had very few sort of preconceived notions. I just sort of dove in and I was like, wait a minute, that's so bizarre that the leaders of the pro-choice movement didn't treat Norma because she was totally uneducated. Was that the case for others? And then I came to see that, unfortunately, class is probably the single biggest issue, in my opinion, in terms of determining whether a woman and a girl is going to have access to abortion, whether she's going to sort of, be helped along to find an abortion provider. And Norma was totally uneducated. Here's another good example of how Norma's life sort of led me to sort of uncover these large truths about abortion in America. Totally uneducated. She dropped out of school. I'll tell you just a tiny bit about her, which is such a fascinating woman. The single biggest thing that I felt made Norma the perfect protagonist was that the same things that ripped her family apart and made unwanted pregnancy so complicated in her family are the same things, in my opinion, that make it so fraught in this country. Like abortion is uniquely fraught in America in a way it isn't in most other countries. Not at all, actually. But in this country, I argue that it's really ultimately, it's the sort of seeming incompatibility between sex and religion that make it so difficult in this country. We have these puritanical roots in this country, and sex and religion are just sort of seen, as things that are irreconcilable. And Norma, unbeknownst to Norma's own family, but when I looked into the family, she was the third straight generation in her family, a woman, third straight generation to have an unwanted pregnancy. And you see where that sent these poor women. Without going all the way back, Norma's mother, imagine this, Norma's mother, Mary, is living in rural Louisiana, and she's 17 and gets pregnant. And her family started off Catholic, they're now Pentecostal, and this is just like a catastrophe. The mother doesn't tell her that she'd also had an unwanted pregnancy with 17, and that she had sort of an immediate marriage and shock of marriage and what that did to her life. She's just horrified, the mom, and says to her daughter, you need to leave. You got to get out of town. So they take this poor girl, she's 17, and they send her to the big city of Baton Rouge. She's then made to deliver her child and then give up the child, like it's not her own child, give up the child to her parents, who then raise the child as their own. And Mary has to pretend, just across the Atchafalaya River, that little girl over there is not her daughter, but is her niece. Now this destroys her, as it would destroy any of us. I'm a parent, and the thought of having to give up my child to my whomever is miserable. And then what happens is, Mary, her life is never the same. She becomes an alcoholic. She gets married. Her marriage just sort of falls apart. I was able to find some of Mary's childhood friends who talked about the sort of before and after in her life. You see these sort of what happens when abortion is not sort of readily available for someone. And this is then the home that Norma grows up in, right? Where sex is not only sinful, but it's illicit. And then all the more so when Norma comes out to her parents, and her sexuality is also sinful and illicit. So it's not shocking then that this woman, Norma, sex and religion, right? Mm-hmm. I found, Norma hadn't talked about this before, but she was a prostitute for a time. I mean, it was just telling her story. I kept feeling over and again like I was telling the story of abortion in America.
Yeah. And with all of that, with all the complexity, another person who I was really interested in the book was Mildred Jefferson, a right to life leader, and she became enormously prominent. And you can see, if you know a little bit about her, why she became so important. She was a doctor, she was a well-trained MD, and an African-American woman. And she was incredibly valuable once she sort of got on the radar to the right to life movement. Right, in the 70s and 1980s. And I found learning about her was so fascinating. She was a character I didn't expect to find in your book, and somebody I didn't know anything about. So I really wondered about, how you found her and how she wound up being one of the characters that you were so fascinated by.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned her. So, I mentioned obviously Norma was this incredible kind of prism, onto this whole thing. But even looking at Norma and her three daughters, there were still sort of pockets of abortion in America that I wanted to touch upon and write about that didn't sort of immediately touch on Norma's life. Like I needed to surround Norma and her daughters with a few other characters. And I looked for those characters because I always wanted, with my wife and I was right here, we have our two little kids, and a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, right? So you want to find a narrative, and then through that person's life, you can talk about this big important thing. So I have an abortion provider, Dr. Boyd, who's a remarkable character. Linda Coffey, one of Norma's two lawyers, who was totally forgotten by history, but really is the architect of Roe, an important woman who was swallowed up by her co-counsel, Sarah Weddington. And then there's Mildred Jefferson. I needed someone sort of I could use to tell the other side. And it was thrilling to find Mildred because she's so important and totally unknown. And I think, she was really the architect of the pro-life movement. She was the first black woman to ever graduate from Harvard Medical School, a brilliant, remarkable woman. And all my characters are from Texas, sort of rural, poor Texas, religious Texas.
And she was a victim of terrible discrimination.
Absolutely. And this is what was so thrilling. So the pro-life to this day sort of pretend that Dr. Mildred Jefferson is this sort of saint of the movement who leaves the heights of medicine. You know, she can be anything she wants, Harvard Med, and then sort of to go cater to the unborn. The truth is very different. The truth is that, and I found an FBI file that enabled me to write all of this, and her ex-husband and a few others. The truth is this. So she wanted to be a doctor, she wanted to be a surgeon, but her career was sabotaged. It was destroyed by misogyny and racism. It's so shocking. You're looking through this FBI file, and these super famous doctors, like there are many organizations and buildings named after these people, they're speaking so comfortably about how, well, you know, she, yeah, very smart woman, but obviously she wasn't going to sort of work with me. She's a black woman. And you're like, you know, this is absurd. It's 1972, 71, 73, and this is what they're saying. And she's so destroyed by this and so upset by this that she doesn't know what to do with her life. She can't get certified as a surgeon. And it's right about that time that the American Medical Association decides that they are going to tell all of their sort of members that, oh, by the way, if you're now in a state where abortion is legal, because abortion was legalized in 4 states pre-Roe, and the most liberal of all those states, I always still get a kick out of it 12 years later learning about it, was California, where Governor Ronald Reagan signed this sort of super liberal.
Not by law, but by practice, not by statute, yeah.
But what was amazing about that was it was even open to non-citizens. Like, you could go to California and have an abortion through the 20th week of pregnancy if you have the money to get there, which Norma didn't. But anyway, so Mildred doesn't know what she's going to do, and the AMA says this, and now she says, okay, I actually, now that I think about it, I'm not a fan of legal abortion. And she's such a spellbinding speaker that she sort of very quickly becomes really the kind of most important speaker in the pro-life world. She's actually on a television show called The Advocates weeks before Roe v. Wade, a national television show. When Ronald Reagan hears her, is so shocked by what she says, he then writes her a private letter that I found saying, wow, I wish I'd heard you before I signed, you know, that piece of letter. You know, in fact, he says, you've convinced me now that abortion is the taking of a human life. And they have this fascinating kind of back and forth. What was really amazing to me about Mildred Jefferson was, here she is. She prefigures the movement actually in a lot of ways, not only in terms of her realizing before anyone else did the sort of political goal that was in abortion. You know, let's politicize this for the benefit of the party. But also, she's a true extremist.
Well, right, and that's the point that I wanted to follow up on about too, yeah.
And what she doesn't tell people. So she believes that abortion ought never to be legal, not in cases of rape, incest. You know, back then that was shocking. There were 50 members of the board of the National Right to Life Committee. She was one of only 3 who felt that there ought not to be exceptions. Now, obviously, it's like ho-hum in this country. But what's really amazing, the very same woman who is saying that every single conception, you know, must lead to a birth, this same woman doesn't tell anyone. Her ex-husband told me, Mildred was not alive when I started writing the book, that because she had suffered so much in life, because of the misogyny and racism she'd endured, she felt when she and her husband, who was white, and that was very important because interracial marriage at that time was illegal in basically half the country, and to enter into a marriage like that was going to be a very complicated thing. She tells her husband-to-be, I will marry you, but on one condition. She says, I have suffered so much in this world. I now know, basically, that to live is to suffer. There is so much injustice in this world, and the precondition for our getting married is that we will not have a child. The same woman who is saying that, you know, everyone else, if you're pregnant, must bring a child into this world. And it's this shocking sort of, you know, how does she then live with that? You know, it's remarkable. And that's something that I sort of plumb.
Well, it's one of like 15 major ironies,
Exactly.
I think, in this particular woman's story,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
That she experiences sexism and then becomes the leader of this
It's
movement
incredible.
that, you know, that is the #1 movement that challenges the women's movement.
Exactly.
Right? It's amazing.
It's shocking.
Yeah. So, and I wonder, her story really leads into this because she's so extreme. And again, I mean, it sounds like Oklahoma today,
Yeah.
right? But at the time, given that there was a huge trend toward liberalization in the late 60s into the early 70s, and many states were considering at least, exceptions for rape and incest, exceptions for the life and the health and the well-being of women. That was so much the trend. And she's pushing the other way at that time. So I wonder, like, from looking at her, but also the other figures in your book, it seems like you could really map out the way that this issue became, not just controversial, but the way it became polar in this kind of hard-edged way that we see today. And I think that's really important for us to understand.
Yeah.
That it was, messier and more gray, and there was a lot more switching back and forth. The political parties were not so fixed. There were a lot of pro-choice Republicans. There were a lot of quote-unquote pro-life Democrats back in the day, and it wasn't it wasn't that kind of polar, hard-edged issue in the late 60s into the early 70s. But now, of course, it is, and I think your characters really help us get there.
I looked for people who would enable me to show that truth that you're expressing. It was fascinating to me. Like, now it is the most polarizing thing. Not only was it not then, and I can give you lots of examples, it wasn't at all a partisan issue. I mean, Reagan, Bush, you can go down the line, they were all pro-choice. On the other side, Dick Gephardt, Al Gore.
Nelson Rockefeller in New York, who signed the liberal abortion law in 1970.
It's Jesse Jackson, all on the other side, Ted Kennedy, all for different reasons. Jackson because he felt that abortion was a particular sort of scourge on the black community. Ted Kennedy because of his Catholicism. But over and I was like,
and they all
wow.
switched.
Yeah, they all switched. They all got in line. Like once there wasn't any room for them in their party. And I think that is actually very sad. When you have to, when something is so black and white, a lot is lost. Now, I make the argument in the book that abortion is actually fraught for good reason. It is a complicated issue. We like to think it is. It is. On the one hand, you have the sort of humanity of the fetus. On the other, you have the very real reasons a woman or a girl might wish to have an abortion, the very compelling reasons. Now, again, the reader knows sort of where I am, but I want to show how we got here. It's very complicated. So just to give, a few examples through these characters. So it used to be that in this country, on the pro-choice side, President Clinton spoke for many when he said that abortion ought to be safe, legal, and rare. But now people will say, well, why should it be rare? In fact, abortion is only a social and moral good. It only empowers a woman. Why should it be rare? And that language sort of really began, the first person to really say that over and again to Congress and others was one of the central characters in my book, a guy named Dr. Curtis Boyd, a very important man. He was providing abortions in Texas pre-Roe, at great risk, obviously. He's still alive. And he was so important to the movement for so many reasons. But I think I argue that the most important reason was his complete impenitence about his work. He didn't say like, oh, I'm performing a sort of a necessary evil. No. And it was important. I'll just, to give you again an example about how the movement has changed, it was fascinating. The National Abortion Federation, the sort of official federation of abortion providers in this country, when Dr. George Tiller sort of moved, the first doctor to sort of move forward past viability, past the point then at roughly 26 weeks when the fetus could survive outside the womb, he was the first one to sort of say, I'm going to now be providing abortions in the third trimester because there are very compelling reasons why a woman needs to have an abortion even late in a pregnancy. Well, when he did that, and this is now a very embarrassing, uncomfortable thing for the National Abortion Federation, but I found in their own minutes that they basically sanctioned him, and they were furious at him. And they said, how dare you do this? We're going to refer you to this board and that board.
I mean, now, of course, he's a martyr of the movement.
Exactly.
Because he was killed by so-called pro-life vigilantes.
Exactly. And 10 years after they sanctioned him, they gave him their highest award. And when he's then assassinated, Dr. Boyd, who was sort of my guy in my book, he says, well, I've always been kind of glad that I could refer people to my friend to do this because it's something I'm uncomfortable doing. But we need this service to be available, I'm now going to do that. And he's now the largest provider of third trimester abortions in America. But just to know, even though you might tell yourself, hey, I do believe that there ought to be third trimester abortions in America because, let's say, a woman's life is at risk or there's sort of some horrible fetal abnormality. Okay, you might think that. I do believe that it ought to be in certain circumstances. And yet, I think it's good for people to really know what that entails. And in the book, you sort of come to see everything about abortion in America, including that.
Yeah, I mean, I tell a slightly different story where it really comes out of the women's movement. Not just the most radical portion of the women's movement, but even a more liberal or moderate wing of the women's movement. Like my mother, who was an attorney who used to wear skirt suits and pantyhose. She wasn't like a radical human being in that way. She wasn't one of the people who was, protesting Miss America with the, throwing stuff in the freedom trash can and stuff like that. Yeah. But she was somebody who said that abortion should just be taken out of the legal code entirely. It certainly should not be anywhere in the criminal code. And it actually shouldn't be regulated at all. It's none of the state's business, none of the government's business. And she actually wrote the first draft of the New York law, which was a full repeal. It was later watered down slightly, but it was a full repeal of all abortion restrictions. And that became the National Organization for Women position, and it also became the position of more radical, freedom trash can type radical feminists of the period, right? Lucinda Sisler in New York and others who had that position. So, I mean, that was a position of 1969, 70, 71 that was pretty broadly carried in the women's movement. And probably not because everybody thought that a very, very late term abortion was a fantastic thing, but that it could be necessary, right? And that at any rate, it was none of the government's business to interfere with people's choices, whatever their choices might be.
What's going to be very interesting now, and obviously, it is, in my opinion anyway, a tragedy that the Supreme Court is, it looks like, going to sort of overturn Roe. We could talk about that, obviously, but what will happen now is when the sort of question goes back to the states, I think we're going to see in a way we don't now, once states begin deciding for themselves, we're going to see the entire sort of gamut of possibilities.
Yes.
Where there are certain states where there are literally no gestational limits, obviously, and then obviously we've got like Oklahoma and Texas where, it'll be the most extreme on the other side.
So maybe we should start doing a little bit of that. People probably have questions, but maybe you can just start us off by saying, so what do you think, what are the top 2 or 3 things that you think your book contributes to the debate that we're having right now and the conversation we're having right now, which seems so urgent, and I think, we're all trying to get our heads around it.
Yeah, I do think ultimately maybe the single most important thing that I wanted to sort of show people is that no matter how strongly you feel about the issue, come to understand that it's complicated for good reason. I think that really is. And that there are good human beings on both sides of the issue. Ted Cruz is not a good human being. Okay, that's.
I'm glad you stipulated to that. Yeah.
He's pretty comfortable saying
that. All people on either side are good, and yet there may be good people on all sides, yes.
Right. In fact, one thing just to sort of say, it was remarkable when you see Norma's life sort of going back and forth. The leaders, unfortunately, on both sides of the movement, they really marginalized her and exploited her and did not do right by her. But it's fascinating when you sort of...
she was not doing so great, on her own.
Absolutely. She gave as good as she got. This is a troubled, complicated, difficult human being. Try writing about her. I mean, it was not easy. But I would just say that... Well, I don't remember what I was just saying, but that's fine, yeah.
There are good people on all sides.
Yeah, exactly.
You got it.
Yeah, you got the idea. But that's really what I was trying to get at, to sort of humanize the issue. And I think, it's been a very surprising thing. Linda Greenhouse, the sort of remarkable writer who's been writing about abortion, in the New York Times for 50 years, literally.
Yeah.
Linda Greenhouse and the Southern Baptist Convention do not agree on much, but shockingly, they both endorsed my book. So that was like, it was a weird thing for me to see that if people feel that they're sort of fairly represented, that, they'll read what you have to say. And I feel like there are lessons in there for all of us in this very, very polarized time. I just mentioned, I mentioned the Southern Baptist Convention. It's crazy. The Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until 1980. Linda Coffey, Norma's lawyer, the woman who filed Roe, the woman who conceived initially of its legal arguments, this brilliant, very important woman who, was totally forgotten, really, until my book sort of reminded people of what she'd done. She was a religious Baptist. And can you imagine that? She's a religious Baptist who's filing Roe. And her community was proud of her. They profiled her. Look at what she's doing. Mm-hmm. It's only in 1980 when there's no more room anymore after, Jerry Falwell and Reagan and others make it impossible for an evangelical to be pro-choice. They then get in line. Not only that, the Southern Baptist Convention, they also come out against homosexuality, basically, obviously, against feminism. And Linda Coffey, who was a feminist, a gay woman, and a brilliant sort of, women's rights activist, there's no more room for her in her church. And she has sort of a breakdown, and I write about that in the book. But we've become so black and white, and I'd like people who read my book to sort of see, go back to when things were a little more gray.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I like that you bring that out, particularly around issues of religion. I mean, what you said about religion and sexuality, I think that's true, but it's also true that the major religious denominations were not so dyed in the wool around this particular issue. And it wasn't, not only was it not polarizing, in our major party politics, but it wasn't so polarizing in our spiritual lives and in our religious lives.
Absolutely.
Right? And I document this a lot. I wrote a lot about the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, which was a clergy-led abortion referral system that was run out of Greenwich Village in New York, and it became national, and thousands of people.
Dr. Boyd was part of it.
Yeah, thousands and thousands of people found safe, semi-legal abortions or illegal abortions through the clergy service. They were mostly Protestant ministers, and then a bunch of Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist rabbis who were helping. Then there were even a few Catholic priests who were involved.
Yeah,
right. Things have really gotten polar in a way that would have been totally unfamiliar to folks in the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, I was shocked to learn that the Catholic Church itself, for 1917 is when they basically say that all abortion from conception is totally verboten. But for 700 years before that, all but 3 of 700 years, they differentiated between abortions pre and post quickening. Only a woman who had an abortion post quickening would be excommunicated. And not only that, a lot of the sort of Christian understanding of abortion is based on a mistranslation of a single verse in the Bible, the Septuagint, the original Greek translation of the Bible.
It was translated from Hebrew into Greek, yeah.
That's right. I happen to speak Hebrew, so I was like, that's not what it means. And I realized that other people realized that too. There was a mistranslation. One thing that's amazing, not a single verse in the Bible, New Testament or Old, addresses abortion. So people want to tell you this comes from on high, be like, you know what, go read the good book. Show me where it says that. And then they say, oh, okay, and then they intuit it in this and that and the other. But
they find it in the penumbras of the good book.
Exactly,
right?
The penumbras and emanations, to quote the sort of, go back to the Supreme Court. It's not mentioned there. There's only one verse where they sort of address even the inadvertent loss of fetal life. It says that if two men, this is in Exodus, if two men are sort of jostling with each other and bang into a pregnant woman and cause her to miscarry, then what happens? And the Bible differentiates between the life of the mother and the life of the fetus.
And the life of the mother counts more.
Way more, yeah. So it's very interesting. The mistranslation, though, says, oh, they're not differentiating between the woman and the fetus, but rather between a fetus formed or unformed. And that is not at all what it says.
I think there's some connection between the women's rights movement and the escalation of anti-abortion sentiment in America. But really the first laws, like the first Connecticut law, is much earlier than that.
1821.
And thank you. And the New York statute was from 1830. It was enacted in 1830. So that's well before when we usually say that the official women's movement gets going in 1848 with the Seneca Falls. So it's actually before that. I think it does have a lot to do with the rise of the medical profession. And it's sort of an infant medical profession in the early 19th century, and the medical profession will get stronger and stronger in the course of the 19th century and exert more control in this area. You see it much more in the 1860s with the original formation of the American Medical Association and a whole host of additional state campaigns, so that by the end of the 19th century, every state in the U.S. has some kind of an anti-abortion statute, right? So I would pin it much more on that. Eventually, it gets tied to the effort by this rising medical profession to get midwives out of the business, to get what they considered irregular practitioners out, that chiropractors and other kinds of people who didn't have, allopathic medical type training, they didn't have that much to offer, but they did have their supposed moral authority and medical authority in this area of dealing with women's problems. So, that's what we see in New York already in the 1820s, that the New York medical profession is influential in the state legislature, and they passed this first abortion control law, which is sort of a poison control law, and it's in the name of protecting women from these dangerous abortifacient drugs that they're taking. It wasn't really about protecting women, although maybe some people thought that that's what it was about. But I would say it's mostly about the rise of the medical profession. Is that what you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's not true when Alito writes that, this has no bearing on that. Nonsense. Of course it does. Legally it does. They hinge on the very same arguments. So I do think, though, that he has no interest personally in that. But of course, that is now vulnerable. And I can, I'm sure you can speak to this, but I'll just add one thing that's really fascinating. It was fascinating to me. 50 years ago, there was a lot of overlap in the fights for women's rights and the fights for gay rights.
Oh, yes, this is a great part of your book.
Oh,
the fight against sodomy going way back.
Yeah. I didn't know any of this.
Against sodomy laws.
And it's kind of fascinating that the three people who came together to bring Roe into existence were all gay. Like, that had never been pointed out before. Norma McCorvey, Linda Coffey, and the person who connected Linda and Norma. An amazing man who sadly was murdered in 1973 named Henry McCluskey. The world needs to know about this man. He was brave. He was fighting the sodomy laws in Texas. And he wasn't the greatest lawyer in the world, so Linda was whispering into his ear and helping him write like what he needed to write about it. But I was just thinking that just as there were fights those two sort of fights are being waged together, so too now. You knock down one, you can knock down the other. I think it's true, and it's sad, and it's scary.
Yeah, I would add, I think it's definitely vulnerable. It might take a little while, and it might make Justice Kavanaugh more hesitant. But those of us who are queer, I would say, get your papers in order. As we did before marriage was legal, right? All those healthcare directives and all that other stuff, right? I think that's probably a good idea. But I think in a bigger sense, though, what I'd like to say as we're starting to end is that, of course, right now we have to focus on the Supreme Court, right? We can't help it because the Supreme Court is incredibly powerful, and it is extreme in exactly the way that we think it's extreme, and it is coming for us. But I think in terms of what we need to do in the period coming, I think we need to take our minds away from the Supreme Court. And I think it could be very dangerous if we get like over-absorbed with a lot of persnickety questions about this doctrine or that doctrine, and maybe Roe really was badly decided, or maybe gay rights really do rest on a weak foundation, and blah, blah, blah. I'm a historian of constitutional law, among other things. Like, there are no weak foundations or strong foundations. They're just our foundations, right? Justices just decide. Like you were saying about Cardozo, they decide at various times for various reasons. They do the shit they do, mostly because they're pressured into it by mass social movements, rising from the ground up. When they do something like legalizing same-sex marriage, or overturning sodomy laws, or restricting the ability of states to regulate abortion, they're responding to enormous power that's being amassed from the ground up, right? And we've all experienced this, right, in the last 50 years. We've all observed it and participated. And I think that's where our attention needs to be, because that's really where the action is and where it's going to be. Like, not with the justices, but with the ordinary people that you write about, with the activists I write about, right? And with us, not with them.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to sort of finish up. Yeah, thank you.